Good evening, lords and ladies. My name is Jared, and today we are going to bring you an all-new podcast called The Console Kingdom. I am here with Dan.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
And we are a show that likes to talk about the past, present, and future of video games with a bit of flavor mixed in. So today's episode is actually going to be quite fun. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. Dan, I know you have as well. This is going to be a fun show. I'm very looking forward to this. We today are going to debate on the greatest console of all time.
Yes, lords, ladies, and loyal subjects of the console kingdom, welcome. Jared and I, we combined have over 50 years of experience playing video games. I've been playing games since the NES. I think the same is true for Jared as well. And, we're both dads
Absolutely.
with families, and we're here to have a good time, have a few laughs, and talk about the greatest console of all time. And I think, Jared, it's going to be a short conversation because obviously the greatest console of all time must be the Nintendo 64, right?
It's definitely within the realm of possibilities if we're in Bizarro world. I don't know if you've noticed I'm wearing my Superman shirt, so I had to throw that reference in there. Look, the Nintendo 64 is garbage, okay? And I don't care if you throw me all kinds of shade. I don't care if you throw me all kinds of hate. You're talking about a console that injured people, a controller that was so baffling that you just scratch your head and say, how in the world am I supposed to use this thing? I mean, maybe 6 good games on the entire console. And
Jared,
you're saying that's the best ever?
Well, I'll tell you why.
Oh, tell me about it.
There's a couple of reasons. There's a couple of really great reasons why the Nintendo 64 was so great. So first, the most important thing is it addressed a very uncommon handicap. Now, those of us who maybe when we were kids, played too close to the nuclear reactor and grew that third arm out of our abdomens, finally had a controller that was built for us. That segment of the population with that additional appendage really benefited from that controller. And not only that, Jared, but most importantly, especially today, and I think we can all appreciate this, especially today, we are overburdened by choices. You turn on Netflix and there's 400,000 different things to watch.
Okay.
You go to play PlayStation, or there's tens of thousands of excellent games to choose from. Both Nintendo 64.
Well, and you got Game Pass. Yeah, Game Pass on Xbox. Man, you could spend all day trying to figure out what the best to play is.
With the Nintendo 64, just roll a die. Number 1 is GoldenEye. Number 2 is Shadows of the Empire. Number 3 is whatever the third good game is, etc. Because that's the only 2 I could think of. Star Fox, there we go. Star Fox 64 was the third one.
Star Fox 64.
And whatever number, just play that one. And there you go. And no burden, you're not burdened by too many choices.
No, and not to mention the fact that, it had to have add-ons just to have a rumble feature. Breaking ground there.
We got to talk a little bit about the controller and how bad the timing was. Because I think I remember reading somewhere that Miyamoto developed and designed that controller specifically just for Super Mario 64. So he didn't think of how that would work for any other game or any other type of game. He only thought about just Mario 64. And now if you've ever played one of the modern remakes of Mario 64, or if you played on an emulator, you probably already know this, but 2 sticks is a million times better than 4 tiny buttons.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fighting with the camera on any 3D game on that system is such a headache. I played the one Castlevania game for a video on my YouTube channel, and it was just a miserable experience. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know some people grow up with this thing and they like it. Maybe they have nostalgia attached to it, but there's no real redeeming qualities here. The controller makes no sense for most of the games. Uh, Most of the games, aren't even that good because I think we all know the story about how the Nintendo 64 basically didn't have anywhere near as many people making games for it, anywhere near as many third party developers making games for it, because Sony was cutting a much better deal. So rather than develop for Nintendo and buy this incredibly expensive dev kit, and then have Nintendo control every like penny and nickel and dime that was coming their way as a result of the game that you created and got out there, uh, they were getting a much better deal developing for Sony. They were making more money developing for Sony. They didn't have to buy an expensive dev kit. They didn't have to buy cartridge shells directly from Nintendo. They actually had a third party, multiple third parties, that you could purchase the blank CD media from. So
Yeah, and
it was a big problem.
and I was going to say, and yeah, it was a big problem. And I was going to say, let's not forget that yes, GoldenEye was a great multiplayer game. It probably
really
had the best multiplayer, best multiplayer on the console. It really, really did. It did go next level, and it actually was better than it deserved to be. But going back a minute, I'm believing you played Castlevania 64, if I'm not mistaken. Is that the one with the level with the nitro and the nitro powder or whatever, and you take one step in the wrong direction and you blow up and die immediately?
I couldn't even tell you because I don't think I even got that far. I got to like level 2. Like, first of all, there's no music. Like, how are you going to have a Castlevania game with no music? And just the gameplay was so horrible, constantly fighting with the camera, the platforming, the 3D platforming. 3D platforming wasn't really very good at that point. So I can't really blame the N64 for that. Like, universally, 3D platforming wasn't very good yet. Like, do you remember kind of the earlier 3D games that came out around the time that had platforming? Like Bubsy 3D and stuff like that? They were all pretty bad. I don't...
Yeah, and I was gonna say with those, I remember on other platforms even. I remember playing Spyro and Crash Bandicoot, and they are some of the best games that the PlayStation had to offer as exclusives to Sony at that point. And even then, some of the jumping, when you're trying to glide as Spyro and Crash, you think, oh, I should have made that jump, and you didn't. And it wasn't perfected at that time period in history.
I think the DualShock was a big part of that, because once the DualShock came out and we had the 2 analog sticks and you had the right stick to control the camera with, I think that really is what made it possible for 3D games, 3D action games, and 3D platformers to really start, coming into their own. So if we go back to Castlevania for a second and then you look at like the PS2, the Castlevania games on the PS2 have way better controls, way better platforming. I know they're not incredibly popular games, but they're definitely a much better experience than Castlevania 64 was. I love those games.
They should be.
I was a little disappointed with those games because they weren't Symphony of the Night Part 2, which is what I wanted them to be. But
right.
But it is what it is. So obviously...
But I was going to say, I would definitely argue that all day long. I loved Lament of Innocence and I loved Curse of Darkness. Two incredible PlayStation 2 games, and I wish that Konami would update them to do a HD remaster. Oh, that would be beautiful.
So, I've shown my bias a little bit here. I'm a huge fan of Castlevania, obviously, and clearly leaning toward the PlayStation end of things. And in that generation, that's what I had. I had the PlayStation, I had the PS2, and I jumped ship to the PlayStation rather, because of one really important game. But I'm going to come back to that. But before we talk about the game that made me change from Nintendo to Sony, I want to throw a few numbers out there, Jared, because I know we did a little research about this stuff, and we wanted to look at some numbers. Now, obviously, we got our kind of tongue-in-cheek, discussion about the N64 out of the way. And look, if you're listening and you like the N64, feel free to come to our social medias, come see us on Twitter, Facebook, and all those things, Discord, whatever. And you can tell us about, your memories of the N64 and your feelings about it. And maybe you can give us something, some nice pros to the N64 that maybe we've missed. But I don't think there are any.
Absolutely.
I don't think there are any, but if anyone can come up with some, I would love to hear them and then tell you why you're wrong. But moving along, so the N64, 33 million, right? They sold 33 million N64s. Now, the N64 was up against what? The PlayStation and kind of a little bit later the Saturn, right? So it was the PlayStation and the Saturn. The Saturn's not really, I think, even in the conversation, right? Because Saturn was kind of, it was like the beginning of the end for Sega at that point. Would you say so, Jared?
Absolutely. I mean, and we had a conversation before about Sega consoles, and at that point in time, the Saturn, the Dreamcast, it was just all downhill from Sega in that aspect of actually making consoles and producing content that way. But that's another conversation for another time.
Yeah, it was kind of the beginning of the end for Sega there. They only sold about 9.25 million units of Saturn, so they sold fewer than 10 million Saturns. Nintendo sold 33 million N64s, which is a pretty decent number. And then the Sony PlayStation, they sold 102 million units. So we're talking about a 3-to-1 over the N64. So looking at the numbers strictly, I mean, the PlayStation is already a much better, at least much more better selling console than the N64. And I think I could pretty safely say it's a better console overall because of the games that we had on that. And the game that made me choose the PlayStation over the N64, I know some of you with our conversation before think I'm going to say Symphony of the Night, but I'm not. I'm going to say Final Fantasy VII. I have always been a huge Final Fantasy fan, ever since the first one on the NES, which today is like a chore to play, but I still love it. I played all these games before they were ever released in the US. Not all of them, but like 2 and 3, and the ones that weren't released here till later, like I played fan translations of those. Huge fan. So for me, I couldn't stay loyal to Nintendo as much as I was a Nintendo kid to the very core of my soul. I couldn't stay with Nintendo when that change happened, because Final Fantasy was going to come out on the PlayStation, and I had to go with where Final Fantasy was.
I wanted to bring up something rather important here, and this is something I wanted to discuss, and actually I feel like it fits well here, about Nintendo as a company, as a whole. Okay, so you and I both grew up playing Nintendo consoles, right? I mean, we were very familiar with the NES, we were very familiar with the Super Nintendo. But then Nintendo came out with the Nintendo 64. And, we've already talked about that. After the Nintendo 64, they had the GameCube, which, sadly, I wish they would have developed more games for, because the GameCube is actually extremely underrated, in my opinion. But then after that, bafflingly, like, Nintendo just... I don't know what happened. I can't put my finger on it. Yes, the Wii sold really well, but it was because of a gimmick, not because of the console itself. The gimmick of the console was the motion controls. The Wii Sports was basically the biggest selling point for the Wii. But during that time frame, it did not have HD, which was really baffling. And then on top of that, they decided, okay, we're going to release the Wii U to counter that. Well, everybody had a Wii, so what's the point of having a Wii U? Oh, it's just got a touchpad and HD graphics, and it's going to cost me this much money to get HD? Yeah, kind of not worth it. And then the Switch came out, and the Switch is actually a pretty good console. Except here we are in 2022, spring of 2022, mind you, and they haven't even updated the Switch yet at all. Like, it's just not there. And I think, I'm not saying that the Nintendo 64 was the beginning of the end for Nintendo, but it definitely put them in third place. And the numbers probably don't necessarily back that up, but let's be frank, I hear more people arguing daily on Xbox versus Sony, and hardly anybody talking about, I'm pretty excited for this Switch game to come out.
Yeah, it's not really in the conversation, and I think that has a lot to do with that lineage going back to the N64, when things changed so much. because we had a new sheriff in town, we had a new player in the game. Now, for those unfamiliar, I think most of us probably know the story by now, but for those unfamiliar, Sony was originally chosen to develop the CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. And now, as far as the real details of exactly what happened, I'm not too sure about everything, but I do know that for some reason, Nintendo chose to instead give that to Philips without the people in charge of the decision discussing that. No one called up Sony and said, "Listen, we are going another way." That conversation never happened. Instead, they just announced that CDI was going to be doing it. Philips was going to be doing it instead. And then Sony already had been working on this prototype of this CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, which, by the way, a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo would have been amazing.
Absolutely.
I mean, the RPG library alone would have been amazing. But anyway, moving along with that, they already had this prototype out there, and they spent all this money, and the decision was made, let's just launch it. Let's launch it as its own standalone video game unit. And in order to make sure that that was a success, they made it cheaper for the third-party developers to develop for it. Nintendo has always had like a stranglehold on, I think it's changed a little bit now because they can't do it anymore. But during those days, like up until the N64, they had a stranglehold on third-party developers. Like, they got the lion's share of the money for any third-party game that was published for the NES. Yeah, they had to buy the cartridge shells directly from Nintendo. They couldn't buy them from a third party. There were a lot of other things a lot of other details involved in all the cost of developing for Nintendo that eventually really bit them in the ass.
Yeah, and Dan, I'm going to take a quick sidetrack here. Hop in the DeLorean, okay? Hit 88 miles an hour and flash forward to the year 2018. Because when you were discussing the whole Sony CD add-on for the Super Nintendo and Nintendo kind of pulling the rug, it made me think of a possible conspiracy theory in the year 2018.
All right.
In the year 2018, we're gonna take a trip to E3 2018. Nintendo flashes during their presentation a number 4 on the screen. And we all knew what that meant. At least us Metroid fans did. Metroid Prime 4. And the more we learned about this game, the more we learned it was not Retro Studios which did Metroid Prime, Prime 2, and Prime 3. No, it was being developed by Bandai Namco. Now, here's the thing about that, though. Okay. For whatever reason, Nintendo did not like what that company was doing and went back to retro. Now, here is what got my mind spinning. I have to wonder, what if Nintendo pulled the same old trick, the same old time, and just took the demo or whatever Bandai had and went to retro and said, hey, you're doing this now. And here we are in 2022, still waiting for Metroid Prime 4.
See, now the question I would ask would be, what has Bandai Namco released, or what is Bandai Namco releasing that would make you think that they had, or actually no, not Bandai Namco, right? What are they releasing, or what have they released, or what have they announced that would lead us to believe that there was some skeleton of a Metroid game that they still had, right? Because we're talking about Sony had the skeleton of the CD add-on, and they released their own console. Is Bandai Namco has worked on, or is going to release something very Metroid-like? Or Metroid Prime-like?
That's a very good question, and it's something I have to research. But, it was just a little bit of a headcanon, little theory. Let's hop back in that DeLorean and go back to the Sony PlayStation.
Yeah, so I mean, the point I was driving at is, obviously, I mean, the Sony PlayStation outsold the Nintendo 64 by a tremendous number of units. They had a lot more games and a lot better games. And I think part of that too is how old we are versus how old somebody who maybe grew up with the N64 was, because we were a little older. We were teenagers when the PlayStation came out. Basically, somebody who's a little younger than we are might have preferred the N64 because we were playing Resident Evil, and maybe the sort of games that the mom and dad of an 8 or 9 year old kid might not really like. They had a lot of games. Like there was definitely a huge change in terms of the family friendly sort of
Yes.
image, right? Nintendo still had that
Yes.
very family friendly image. It was starting to shake up a little bit because they had Doom and they had Mortal Kombat 2 and 3. But and Doom Troopers, my God, Doom Troopers was a violent game. I don't. It's a terrible game, but it's also fantastic. Um, we can talk about that another time. It's the game's bad. The controls are bad, but just the fact that you can like shoot at a guy hanging from a tree and his head will like stay in the tree and his body falls down. There's just something amazing about a 16-bit game that is just that gory, and it was on the Super Nintendo. But anyway,
Right.
I digress. So the games were kind of maturing with us a little bit, and they wind up with like our Grand Theft Autos and stuff like that. Obviously, we had the Final Fantasy franchise, we had the Resident Evil franchise, Castlevania, Street Fighter, Tekken. So many huge franchises and huge games. Tomb Raider, Metal Gear Solid. I mean, the list goes on and on of the games that were on the PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64 just didn't have that library. Later on, they started getting some of them sort of
Well,
trickling in.
and that just brought to mind too, because we were talking about crossovers and how Final Fantasy went. Mega Man 8 was released on PlayStation. Mega Man X3 was on PlayStation. X4 was on PlayStation. Mega Man Legends, I would dare argue that it is absolutely better on the PlayStation than it was on the Nintendo 64. And how interesting that Capcom was with Nintendo for a lot of the classic Mega Mans, and then Mega Man jumped with Sony. And not exclusively with Sony, but they did deal with Sony.
Yeah, they did eventually. I think Mega Man 8 did come out on the N64, didn't it? Because I remember seeing a comparison. And I can give the N64 this much credit, that it did have smoother, what was it, pixel shading, I think? Their models looked smoother, like it had better anti-aliasing or something. So it was a little bit faster processor, and it was able to make things look nicer and look smoother. And of course, you didn't have to worry about the load times. So they stuck with the cartridge media, even though the rest of the world was over cartridges completely. They stuck with the cartridge media while the rest of us were, or I should say the rest of the world was going to CDs, and there was now full motion video, and there was CD quality audio. And on these CDs, it had, 700 megabytes of storage space, and then you had these cartridges with about 24 megabytes of storage space, where you couldn't do all those things. So there was a really big difference in terms of what you were capable of creating on that media. And of course, getting a little slightly technical, a cartridge is basically just a flash card. You stick it in, and it's solid state. It reads immediately. There's no loading. Nothing has to ever load. With a CD, everything on the CD has to be loaded into memory. So especially if you have a slower read speed, it takes a long time. Today with emulation, we can speed up that CD read speed, but you couldn't do it back then. So maybe one little feather in the cap of the N64 there, one little tiny one.
Yeah, and that was a discussion that we had, kind of a little off topic, but that was a discussion we had the other day about Final Fantasy VI on the PlayStation and its load times.
Yeah, incredible game, but I mean, those Final Fantasy re-releases on the PlayStation were really hard to play because of those load times. It just took absolutely forever. And these were 16-bit games. It shouldn't have taken that long to load them, but it was just the nature of the beast at the time. So we talked about the PlayStation outsold the N64 3-1, and the lineage on the Nintendo side. I mean, GameCube, like you said, probably an underrated console because I think a lot of the audience at that point had gone to Sony.
Yeah.
Sega still had a small audience, I think. And then, the Wii sort of brought the audience back, but Nintendo basically became kind of a niche, right? Like, Nintendo's first-party titles are some of the best games out there, and that'll probably always be the case because their first-party titles are always excellent. I think Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild and Metroid Dread are all incredible games. And I think if you were to sit down and think, oh, what are the best games on the Wii, on the Wii U, you know, you're only gonna be saying those first party Nintendo titles for most of the time. I don't think there's that many third party titles on any of those consoles that were really all that great. But Mario Party, Mario Kart, Mario, Zelda, Kirby, Metroid, all those first party titles, Pokemon. Those are the big things that kind of kept Nintendo relevant. While they were solid number three in the console wars.
Yeah.
And I think they're almost happy there. Like, it seems like there's very little ambition from Nintendo to try and climb in the console market. I think they found their niche, and I think they're happy there.
Yeah.
Everyone's making money, they're making a living, the company is doing well, and they'll let the big guys duke it out and buy up every third party studio in the world to try to compete with each other in terms of what licenses they own,
Exactly.
and how many games they can develop.
Exactly. Yeah, and I was just gonna say too. I mean, yeah, obviously they're making money. Nintendo never has sales, and most of their games are still $59.99. Just saying.
I'm getting worried about these game prices, man. Games are coming up now. Games are launching out with like $80 now.
Are they?
Like, I almost never buy new games because I don't want to spend that much money on a game. It's a lot of money. And at what point do you price yourself out of business? Right? Because we have the games are $80 and there's DLC that's not included in that $80 price. Like, at what point do games become so expensive that people stop buying them?
Right, right. And that's something really actually interesting that you had mentioned there is the pricing too, because I just thought about the last game I purchased was Soul Calibur 6, and that game came out in 2018, and I somehow caught it on sale and got it for like $18.99 with all the DLC, Battle Pass, all that kind of stuff, whatever it
Nice.
had. If I would have waited 4 more days, it would have gone right back up to $59.99. And I mean, honestly, I don't know about most people, but the way things are right now, I just can't see people being able to afford extras like $60 games on a continual basis. It just, I don't know,
Oh, fighting games are the worst. Fighting games are the absolute worst because they have made DLC mandatory to the point where half the roster is DLC. And fighting games are also highly competitive, and you have to lab. And you can't lab a character that you don't have. So you have to buy the DLC, or else you're going to get bodied every time you try to play online.
Yeah.
And now I'm terrible at, I love fighting games. I'm terrible at them. I love them, but I'm really, really bad at them. But like Tekken, I love Tekken. And I had to have all the characters. I had to have all the DLC because I wanted to be able to lab every character and be less bad at it. But they have to do that because video games now are so expensive to produce. They cost more. It costs more now to produce like a AAA game than just it does to produce a Hollywood movie. Not obviously necessary. Like, obviously, like Justice League costs more to produce than like Tekken. But in general, games are starting to cost more to produce than a Hollywood movie. That's ridiculous.
And what's interesting about that too is I'm glad you brought up AAA games because I've polled a few of my friends and even some family members, and the results are actually quite interesting. That most of my family members and friends prefer indie titles over AAA games because AAA games are becoming so much of the same thing over and over and over again.
Yes.
Whereas these indie titles are absolutely gorgeous and beautiful and just amazing. And it's like two guys sitting in a basement making this incredible piece of art and that people fall in love with. I mean, Undertale, I can't imagine cost more than, a couple grand, maybe a little bit more than that. I'm not sure how much their Kickstarter was, honestly. I don't know how much it really cost to do that, but Undertale blew up like crazy. And that was an indie game. And I would say at the
I mean, that's
time,
kind of,
it was one of the best games of that
yeah.
year.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot more like what games used to be like. Like when we were kids, you look back at like Nintendo NES games and you look at the credits and there's like 6 people
Yeah.
that made these
Yep.
games. Now you've got entire teams of hundreds of people working on a single game. Like games are getting so big that they like outsource to third-party companies. Like in Final Fantasy 15, for example, they outsourced the creation of so many of the 3D character models. Like most of those monsters were created by like this random third-party Chinese company that does 3D graphics. They weren't even created by Square Enix. They were created by some company in China and put into the game.
Yeah, and I would say too.
And that's how big these games are
Oh
getting.
yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, if you ever beat Doom Eternal, um, the credits, the ending credits, thankfully you can hold the A button to skip.
They're like an hour
Because no,
long.
I'm serious. It's about at least a good 5 minutes, if not longer than that. And that's just
And I think that's the trap that like
credits.
yeah, I think the trap that like pretty much any medium goes through, right? Like any kind of art form or medium goes through. The more it's a product, and the bigger that product is, and the more money that product starts to generate, the more important it becomes to continue producing a consistent product. So you wind up getting a lot of the same over and over again because people keep buying a lot of the same over and over again. So now you fall into that trap. What are they going to spend $20 million on? Are they going to spend $20 million making a game that they don't know whether people are going to want to buy it? Or are they going to spend $20 million making a game that's exactly like what sold 100,000 million billion copies last year?
Well,
Which is why we had our annual Assassin's Creed game for a while. It's why we have Call of Duty, this and that and the other, and Modern Warfare, and all these games that are the same exact game year after year after year after year.
yeah. And, I was going to say a very good modern example, like very current modern example of that. What you're describing is the Lego Star Wars series. You have Lego Star Wars, the complete saga, and then you have Lego Star Wars, the Skywalker saga. And they're pretty much the same game, I mean, in general, but people went nuts over Skywalker saga, the Skywalker saga. And,
Oh, but those are delightful.
oh, yeah. Yeah. But I mean, that's what I'm saying.
Those are delightful.
That's what I'm saying, though. That's what's interesting to note is that it's pretty much the same game, but people are eating it up.
Yeah. Yeah, and no one wants to take a risk on, spending a whole lot of money on something having not be a success. And I think these games being so expensive to produce is also what's driving the market toward that sort of software as a service model, where now it's going to be more and more about the Game Pass and the PlayStation Plus and all those kinds of services, because those are services that are going to allow players to play many games, many games for a monthly flat fee, and never have to actually purchase them. It's a better pricing model for the publishers. They wind up making more money that way, and consumers spend less money. And it's kind of a win for everybody except for people who might, prefer to have a copy of the game in their collection.
That brings up a very interesting thought that I had. Do you remember mid 90s, late 90s when cell phones started becoming popular? And you had to wait till 7, 8, 9 p.m. at night to make free calls, or you had to pay 10 cents per text message. And you remember how revolutionary it was when they introduced later on in the mid 2000s the Simply Unlimited plan, where you paid a flat rate and everything was unlimited. You had unlimited data, you had unlimited text, you had unlimited calls. And it's exactly, what you're saying. You got to think about it like that. It's like that's where these companies like Game Pass, Xbox with its Game Pass, and PS Now for PlayStation are going. You're paying that flat fee, and honestly, it's so much more convenient. It is so much more convenient and it's just kind of sad though too, because basically everything's going digital. Everything's going digital. We're not having any copies, physical copies left.
A lot of the old heads like us are going to want those physical copies. They want them for the collection. I mean, I don't really mind. I've been buying digital games on Steam for like 14 years at this point. Like, I really don't care that much about having, unless it's a specific game that I really, really want in my collection. Like, I think Final Fantasy VII Remake is a terrible game, but I have it in my collection because Final Fantasy. Like, that's the thing I wanted to have a physical copy of. Just certain things like that. But all the stuff we're talking about right now are reasons why I feel like anything like this generation and the past two. So going back to like the PS3 and the Xbox, like or the Xbox, what was it? The Xbox 360. Anything going back that far is out of the conversation of best console of all time, because it's like the whole gaming industry has changed so much, and it kind of sucks now. All this kind of nonsense that we have to deal with. You can't just like buy a game and put it in and it works. Like you put it like you buy you can even buy a brand new game, buy a physical disc, right? You buy a physical disc, you have a brand new game, you put it in your console. And then what happens? What's the first screen you see, Jared, when you put a game disc in your console?
Your queue, because it starts installing on your hard drive.
And then once it installs,
Updates.
It needs an update.
Yep. And that brings me to, or brings us anyway, to how do we define what the greatest console of all time is? Now, honestly, we're going to, in my opinion, I can't say that, a lot of these games that are out now weren't completed. In fact, one of the greatest Sonic games ever made, Sonic Mania, was when it released, it wasn't completely complete because they patched it and changed an entire boss fight in that game. And there's just so many different things. So, in my opinion, going to probably the PS2 back, because that's the last time I can remember that you bought a disc for the PlayStation, you bought a cart for the Nintendo, whatever game you had, it was finished, complete, done.
You put it in, and you can play the game. You can play it right away. There's no patch. There's no day one patch to fix the game that shipped broken.
Exactly.
How many of these games ship? How many games ship incomplete nowadays? It's absurd. I can't believe how many games ship and the disc needs an update right away to even make the game playable. It drives me absolutely batty, because they know they can. And one of the things that I always say, you get the whole argument of like, oh, I like physical games over digital because I want to know that I can just put it in and play, 10 years from now when the servers are offline. But you're not going to be able to just put it in and play 10 years from now when the servers are offline, because that day one patch that fixes everything broken about the game isn't going to be there. So you're going to have some broken, unplayable mess of a game. You're not even going to have a complete game.
Exactly.
And that's not for every game, obviously. There's, obviously not every game is going to be like that, but a lot of games are. There are games now that like the game installs and it's like 100 and something gig. Those Blu-ray discs only hold 50 gig of data, so like half of that data has to be downloaded. So I mean, the whole thing stinks. For us old heads, old guys like us, grew up on the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo and the Genesis and all that. I just want to put a game in and play, and I don't want to have to pay extra for like, little tiny bits of content.
Yeah.
That drives me up a wall. Like, we talked about the fighting games before, but the fighting games kind of, they have to do that because they have to somehow pay for the online component of the games. They keep these games online and they make it possible to play online. They have to pay for that somehow. So yes, having regular like monthly DLC packs is basically like a way of getting around charging a subscription
Fee. Yeah.
So like, I kind of get it. I kind of do. I still hate it, but like,
right.
I kind of get it. So I would say if we're talking about, what's the best console of all time, I think we have to really look at the quality of the games in the game library. And for me, definitively, I have to say, you know what? But it's more than that, right? It's more than that. It's the quality of the games in the game library, the performance of the console itself. It has to look and play and feel and sound nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also like the comfort. Does it have a good controller? Are there good peripherals? Right. So I would say, kind of taking all those things into consideration. Personally, I know that the Super Nintendo is definitively the best console of all time. I'm going to tell you why. Number one, the game library is out of this world. You got Super Mario World, you got Mario Kart, Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Donkey Kong Country, Street Fighter 2, Star Fox, Killer Instinct, Gradius, Super Contra, Super Punch Out, Super Metroid, one of the greatest games ever made, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I mean, I'm just rattling off the top of my head fantastic must-play games that I think anybody who is an enthusiast who loves video games absolutely has to experience. And they are all on the Super Nintendo. And I'm going to make one really, really big point about the Super Nintendo that I think is really important for anybody who is a huge fan of video games. Every controller design, except for Nintendo's own, where they went in a completely different direction, has been based on the layout of the Super Nintendo controller. They are the first one to put a D-pad on the left, 4 buttons on the right, and 2 shoulder buttons. And a more curved, rounded form factor. Best controller of its time, hands down. Best controller of its time. And the first time that I played a PlayStation demo at a Blockbuster Video and held that controller, and I looked at it and said, "This is a Super Nintendo controller with hand."
In my opinion, you could definitely make a solid case for the PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2 was the best-selling console of all time, okay? And I understand that sales aren't everything. I get that. Sales aren't everything. But you've got games like Ratchet and Clank Going Commando. You've got Sly Cooper, Spyro the Dragon, Metal Gear Solid 2. I mean, there's so many amazing games that hit the PlayStation 2, and they were disc-based games. They had better capabilities for FMV, for sounds, for actual orchestral sounds. I mean, Final Fantasy X is probably one of the best games on the console, despite the story being a weaker Final Fantasy story. I still love Final Fantasy X. I think it's a great, fantastic game. There's just some moments in it that I'm just kind of about. PlayStation 2, they really came into their own. The nice, sleek, black-looking controller. You had the dual shock, you had the analog stick. It was a wired controller, I get it. But it had the L1, it had the 4 buttons on the back. You had your triangle, X, square, and circle, analog sticks, and the D-pad, right? And it fit so comfortably in your hand. And I will say that in my personal experience, I have spent the most amount of hours gaming on the PlayStation 2. And, I mean, that's just in my opinion. And I say, honestly, if it's not number 1, then it's definitely 1.5. It has to be. Because you really couldn't argue anything else, right? I mean, Xbox had Halo, and we had multiplayer with Xbox and stuff like that. Okay, that was kind of fun. That was kind of cool. But man, I tell you, PlayStation 2 was where it was at, and you had games like Hot Shots Golf 4 that you had a server you could connect to, Final Fantasy 11 you could play online. Just so many different features that came with the PlayStation 2 that were, I don't know if they were necessarily ahead of its time, but they were definitely more cutting edge than what we were used to at the time. And honestly, the Super Nintendo library is going to be one of the hardest libraries to beat. In fact, in my opinion, it's got the best sound system on any console of all time. Most of the games for the Super Nintendo had absolute downright bangers of soundtracks. I mean, to this day, I still listen to Donkey Kong Country music. I still listen to Mario World music. I still listen to Mega Man X music. I still listen to just so many different games from the Super Nintendo. Star Fox, Corneria, oh my gosh, that was a great song. But really, you had things like Bullet Time with Max Payne in Max Payne and on PlayStation 2. I don't know. It's a very interesting argument, one way or the other. But I honestly believe.
Hey! Super Nintendo had bullet time.
Okay.
Gradius 3
Okay.
and
Okay. I'm
Contra
talking
3.
Matrix.
They had bullet time. There were you would get certain parts of the
Well, that's
level,
because
and
too
everything
many
was slowed down.
sprite limitations. That's not bullet time. That's
bullet time.
Sprite limitations.
And also, you could put more memory chips on the cartridge to make it bigger. You couldn't put more memory chips on a DVD-ROM.
No, you couldn't put more memory chips on there. But already out of the gate, a compact disc had more storage space than a cart.
Yes, more storage space and long load times. And most of the data on those were just for their crappy, stupid games. Because the PlayStation 2 had, let's see, how many games were released for the PlayStation 2? Total number of games released in North America was 1,601 games. In Europe, 2,952. And in Japan, 5,482 games. That comes directly from Sony, by the way. How much of that library is shovelware?
Okay, I could give you that.
Like 2/3
I could give you that.
is shovelware. Some of the worst games ever. They have these terrible like third party, and these are licensed games. Like these terrible like European like fairy tale games that have these off-brand Snow White and stuff like that. This is the kind of nonsense they are putting out on the PS2. So it has this huge library. It's mostly shovelware. Now, 155 million PlayStation 2s were sold. 155 million, and that's a lot. That's a lot of PlayStation 2s that were sold. And how many PS2s did you buy?
You want the truth, or do you want me to make something up? No, I'll tell you the truth. I bought 3 of them over the years.
You bought 3 of them. So they sold the most units, but one guy had to buy 3 because they broke. The damn things broke. It's probably real. It's getting harder and harder to find working ones these days because the damn things broke. The stupid ribbon cable that connected the disc tray to the power button, that would constantly break. I had a PS2 that broke. It's very sad. It's very sad that it broke. But I was definitely not alone. A lot of people had PS2s that broke. They broke. So that 155 million figure, as impressive as it sounds, is the result of a lot of people buying a new one after theirs broke. Not only that, but let's talk about, is the thing that sells the most necessarily the best thing? I mean, Taylor Swift is the number 1 selling singer in the world. Does that mean she is the best singer in the world?
No, we all know it's Ariana Grande. Come on.
I mean, I can't really debate that. So there you go. So the Super Nintendo is the Ariana Grande of consoles. It's just so much better in every single way than the PS2, than everything. It's better than everything. The Super FX chip, man. We're talking about like 1994 with a cartridge system, a 16-bit cartridge system, running hardware that was already kind of iffy on being current. Nintendo were wizards, absolute wizards at taking like old, outdated hardware and making it work. The NES had like 3 generations old hardware when it was released. That's why everything looks awful by today's standards. But Super Nintendo, they had the Super FX chip where they were making 3D games on a 16-bit console in like the mid-90s. That's ridiculous. That is mind-boggling.
And that does, and again, like I said, trying to play devil's advocate here, but there is one point that I want to make that I think is important. They don't make PS2 minis like they make the Super Nintendo Mini, the Nintendo Mini, and those things sold out so quickly, which goes to show that the Super Nintendo still is incredible.
But you know what? I mean, part of that does have to do with the fact that, for one thing, with such a large library and so many third-party titles, it's probably really, really hard to like have a nice core group of titles. With the Nintendo stuff, they can always fall back on those first-party titles, and everything else is kind of optional. It would be cool if you could update those. That'd be awesome. But I digress. And it's also really hard to emulate. I mean, I know a lot of people aren't going to want to hear this, but when you buy like a mini Super Nintendo, SNES Classic, whatever you want to call it, it's just a tiny mini computer that's running an emulator. It's not. It's a little computer that's running an emulator. It's not an actual Super Nintendo, and it's actually
Right.
really really tricky to do that with PS2 because you have to have a very fast processor, and to have a very fast processor in such a small package is very difficult to do. There's not enough room for
Yeah.
the other components. It gets too hot. So I could see how eventually, I mean, they did a PlayStation Mini, but it isn't very good because the emulator they chose to use is like the worst emulator on the market. But
Yeah.
so that one didn't really do very well, and I think we all pretty much at this point know that most people just hack them anyway. Just hack the
Yeah.
mini
For
hack
the
hack
most part.
hack the mini consoles anyway. So yeah, I think Super Nintendo. I mean, the Sega Genesis definitely gave it a run for its money for a while. The Genesis was really good with the processor because it was like a really super fast processor. It was like an 8 megabyte, 8 megabyte processor, which was way no 8 megahertz rather processor, which is way faster than like anything else on the market at the time. And they used like the Motorola chip, the old X68K chip that like everything used. So they were able to do a lot of cool stuff like arcade friendly, I guess you might say. So not really arcade accurate because the graphics were horrible, but like very, very good at arcade ports for the most part. Although
Yeah, and
the Genesis graphics are awful compared to the Super Nintendo, like terrible.
yeah, the Golden Axe. I remember playing on the
Yeah,
Genesis, and I
that
remember
plays nice.
playing at the Pizza Hut.
Yeah,
Yeah, Golden Axe. I remember playing at the Pizza Hut down the road from my house when we went to cash in our bucket tickets and get our free personal pan pizzas.
there you go. Yeah, and that plays nice. Like even that horrible Mortal Kombat port that looks and sounds like absolute garbage plays pretty nice. I mean, it only has 3 colors and half the animation frames are missing, but it plays pretty smooth. And and of course you could unlock the original fatalities, so that was nice. And the Genesis did in the beginning. It did beat the Super Nintendo in the beginning because the Super Nintendo's library wasn't that big. But after a little while, once the Super Nintendo library started really fleshing out, it just absolutely destroyed the Genesis. Genesis sold 31 million units. Apparently, up to 4.5 million licensed units were sold as well for the Sega Genesis. So like not
Okay,
actual Sega consoles, but like Genesis consoles in a different shell sold under a different name by a different company,
gotcha.
but it was licensed.
License. Yeah.
So about 35 million, and the Super Nintendo sold 49 million. So that's pretty good, pretty close. Pretty close there. But the Super Nintendo definitely the better console. Of course, Genesis has one of the best knockoff games ever made. One of the best knockoff games ever made is Streets of Rage, and
Streets of Rage.
Streets of Rage was a knockoff of Final Fight, and they made a better game. Sega made a better game by making a knockoff of Final Fight. It is a better game.
Absolutely. I would agree with you there. And, I was going to say, too, thinking about the Super Nintendo a little bit, one of my favorite games, and I think this is a vastly untalked about, underrated game, was ActRaiser and ActRaiser 2. Those games were absolutely fantastic. And,
I love ActRaiser. ActRaiser
oh,
is fantastic.
they were hard, but man, were they
Yeah.
fun.
Well, ActRaiser wasn't too hard. I mean, it was hard, like definitely because you had the two different sequences, right? You had the simulation sequences, then you had the action sequences. And the simulation sequences were actually not hard at all once you figured out what to do. You just had
Yeah,
to go around and shoot the monsters and build the city, and that was really fun. But then the action parts could get like toward the end, especially got very very hard. And I do
yeah.
remember finishing that game, back in the day on the Super Nintendo, but ActRaiser 2 is another beast, man. ActRaiser 2 may be I would wager that ActRaiser 2 is probably the most technical and like most complex 16-bit action game. There's so many things you can do. You can move your character and attack in a number of different ways. You have to be able to do all of it. And the game is incredibly challenging if you don't know how to do all the stuff. Like you can do like a dive and you can fly and you could do certain kinds of magic if you hold the right button. You know, the controls are very complicated. The character is capable of doing a tremendous number of different things, and the game is very, very, very hard. Even like I've played that game with cheats and codes and stuff. I still can't beat it. I can't beat that game even if I cheat. That's how hard that game is. But if you put in the time and you really like practice and learn all the different things the guy can do, it is beatable. But it's a labor of love, to say the
Most
least. It is a
definitely.
labor of love. If you
Most
haven't
definitely.
played ActRaiser 2, I challenge everybody out there to play ActRaiser 2. I know these old games are expensive to buy, emulators exist. Play ActRaiser 2 and try to get past the first level on normal difficulty. I would bet $1 that like for like maybe 1 in 10 people can do it on their first try. Maybe 1 in 10.
Yeah, yeah. And, well, I mean, that's just like Super Ghosts and Goblins. I mean, that game was infamous for its difficulty, but
Brutally hard.
it was after some practice you could do it. But man, I remember playing it the first time, and I might have made it like 6 feet, and then 6 feet under, because I died so many times in that game, and
It speaks to how good the game is. It
yeah,
speaks to how good that game is, that it was so hard. And like me as a kid who had no patience for really hard games, I got, with a lot of hard work, I got to like the stage where you're inside the monster
okay,
and you're like fighting its internal organs.
yep,
I got
yep,
that far. I think
okay,
that's as far as I got on my own. Actually, no. I want to say I think I did get up to that first. You know the boss, not the last boss, but the door right before the last boss. I think I did get up to him on my own
okay.
without the stage select.
But that goes,
And then of course you have to play it again
yep,
from the beginning
from the
and get
beginning,
the bracelet and
yeah, and that goes to show too. Now that I think about it, I have to wonder how many PlayStation 2 games were really brutally hard, like to the point where you rage quit. You know what I mean?
yeah, I feel like that was sort of like the generation of games that we played to experience the story.
Yeah,
I don't think there were really a lot of particularly hard games at that time. You know, it seems like the racing games were the most popular ones. I think that the Gran Turismo games were the most popular games, believe it or not. And then like GTA was really, really popular. And like Final Fantasy games have always been. I know like some people say, oh, it's pretty hard, but they're actually pretty easy games.
yeah,
You know,
yep.
it's just a question of knowing, what to do. Once you know what to do, they're all pretty easy. Um, yeah, but and then yeah, like the GTA games, and then fighting games and stuff are only as hard as the person you're playing against. There are a lot of RPGs and like a lot of cinematic sort of adventure games where there really wasn't that much difficulty. You look at like Devil May Cry, just a hack and slash, a little bit of platforming, and some of the fights you have to try a few times. I think the hardest PS2 game I ever played was probably Chaos Legion.
Really, really.
Yeah, that game's kind of ridiculous. Oh, it's a really hard PS2 game, Shinobi.
Okay. I was gonna say Dante Must
Have you
Die
played it?
mode
Shinobi's so hard.
in Devil May Cry 3. That was a PS2 game. Oh my! I mean, I put the practice in on the easier difficulties to learn the combos, to do everything that you can do, to get your button combinations right and everything like that. But I have never beat Dante Must Die mode on Devil May Cry 3.
It's funny. I remember I played a game recently called Drakengard, which is a PS2 game. And I remember distinctly playing that back in the day and like having no idea what to do.
Okay.
and then I like really easily got through the first like third of the game in like a couple hours. So I don't even know what happened there. I don't know. I just remember that game being like, I don't know what to do in this game, and this I very easily figured it out for some reason. There were some cool games though, like some cooler like lesser known games like Bujingai. I always like Bujingai, the Forsaken City. Have you ever played
I
that?
have not.
It's not a great game. It's just kind of like a standard 3D action platformer, but the character you play as is played by the Japanese singer Gact.
Okay.
And I just thought that was so cool because I was going through a major weeb phase during that time, and Malice Miser was like my favorite band, and he was the singer from that band. So like, so that was that tickled me. It was cool because we had a lot more, I think, during that era, especially a lot more of like the Japanese stuff kind of coming over here.
Which reminds me, did you ever get a chance to
That's all over with
did you
now.
ever get a chance to play the bouncer?
I did, I played that recently, and ugh. So that was Square's first PS2 game. I don't know why they chose to put that out. I mean, I don't want to say it's bad. I don't. Because it is kind of fun. It's a beat 'em up. It's like a 3D beat 'em up. You can switch characters. Um, the biggest thing that stinks about that one is you can't play it on an emulator really because the buttons are pressure sensitive,
Yeah.
and if you don't, and like if you press the button, like they always do a heavy attack instead of a light attack, so like you're doing like jump spinning back kicks instead of like punch.
Right.
So that kind of stinks, So that kind of stinks, But yeah, it's a game. It's certainly a game. Whoa. But I assume you had something else you wanted to say about the game if you brought it up.
Oh, well, no, actually, I kind of wanted to get your opinion on it because I remember playing it, but it's been so long since I've actually seen or even played that game that I can't remember too much about it, except there was this really funny part with something to do with a dog, and I can't remember. It was unique. It was very, very unique. I remember it. I remember it.
I mean, they tried to do beat 'em ups
Yeah.
in 3D, and
No,
you
that's
can
all I
push your
was going to
thought.
say. Is that I just it was unique.
Yeah, they tried to do beat 'em ups in 3D, and I don't think they ever really got it right. Like 3D beat 'em ups were always kind of crappy, right? Like there was the perfect weapon on PS1, which is like unplayable. It has tank controls. It's supposed to be a beat 'em up. It has tank controls. There's that really bad Crow game
Oh,
that's kind of the same thing, beat 'em
yeah.
up with tank controls. Uh, there was Fighting Force. I think the best like 3D beat 'em up game I ever played was Gekido on the PlayStation. You ever play that?
I did not.
That was pretty good. That's a fun two-player experience. But yeah, man, the 3D beat 'em up never really caught on, and we can see that now because like the best beat 'em ups now are when they go back to 2D and bring back, like Streets of Rage 4 is an incredible game, an awesome game. I know like River City Girls is real popular. Whenever they go back to that 2D style with the beat 'em ups, it always works out a lot better. So
Oh,
that just
I'm
never
telling
works
you.
in 3D. Never worked in
Which
3D.
which I am gonna say this now. When TMNT Shredder's Revenge comes out, I'm getting it for the Switch, and you absolutely
Hmm.
have to get it for the Switch. I
Yeah,
don't care if I
I
have to
will.
buy it for you, but we are definitely gonna play that game together. I don't know if we're gonna do anything special with it, but I definitely want to play that game with you. Just to relive some of those Turtles in Time memories and some of the arcade game memory. Oh man, I'm so excited for that.
Yeah, I mean, if there's interest, then we could do something on Twitch or something like that.
Yeah,
You
for
know, we didn't
sure.
talk about it all. We didn't talk at all about the Xbox, and I feel like we kind of. So I mentioned before a little bit like there during that time around like the PlayStation PS2 era. There's a lot more like the Japanese games coming over, and like anime was really popular, and I'm sure I was not the only one going through a big weeb phase at the time. And I think the Xbox kind of landed in a weird spot because the Xbox was from here. So it didn't really have a lot of those like Japanese third party developers, and it didn't really get a lot of the Japanese games. And I think it kind of started, the trend that we see now that the number two console uh, was really focused on delivering Western titles. And by the time the next generation came around and, we moved to the PS3 and the Xbox 360, I think we started seeing a lot more Western big titles and a lot fewer Japanese ones.
Yeah.
And like from what I understand today, like the console gaming market in Japan is like dying a slow and painful death. Video games in Japan are like they just play on their phones.
Gotcha.
That's kind of sad.
Yeah.
So one more reason why the Super Nintendo is so great. So many more cool Japanese games that you can play today, and pretty much like you'd be amazed if you look at like the all like the Japanese RPGs and stuff. You'd be amazed at how many of these games have fan translations out there. It's out of this. I can't believe it. Like I started looking at it, the NES too. I started looking at it, and the number of these Japan-only titles that have been fan translated is absolutely astonishing. Just about anything you could think of and want to play has been translated. It's out of this world.
Which is actually a really good thing, and honestly, if we're gonna talk about that, I would be remiss without mentioning Nintendo Switches or Nintendo's Live Direct, where they announced things like triangle strategy and I can't remember.
Boring.
Yeah. No.
Triangle strategy so boring. It's so boring.
But no, I meant those JRPG games that they're porting to the Switch for the first time ever as an official port.
Yes.
But I can't think of the.
I'm excited. I'm excited for Front Mission 2.
That's it. Front Mission
2. There is a fan translation of Front Mission 2. I've never played it. There is a fan translation of the first Front Mission, and that I have played, and that is phenomenal. That's an excellent game. Front Mission, I first experienced Front Mission on PlayStation with Front Mission 3, because that was localized here, but it was like not promoted at all. And I think the only reason I even knew it existed was because I had like a demo on a demo disc. Because I used to send away, when you buy a game and it would have that registration card that everyone would throw away. I would actually fill those out and send them in, and I would get demos in the mail all the time.
Nice.
So and one of those demos, I had the Legend of Legaia demo. I had the Front Mission 3 demo. I had a demo of a game called Threads of Fate. But anyway.
Yeah.
So Front Mission 3 is an excellent game, and the first Front Mission is definitely a super downgraded version of that. But it's like it's like a turn-based grid-based strategy game. But instead of your typical swords and magic and all that, you have Avancers, which are basically like mechs. So it's like Mech Warrior, but like turn-based strategy version. Very, very good. Final Fantasy Tactics with giant robots, basically.
Which is incredible, to say the least.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think we've come to a fairly good
and Live Alive.
Oh, Live Alive, yeah. Yep.
Or Live Alive, or Live Alive, or Live Alive, or whatever. That one also.
Yep. I think we've come to a fairly solid conclusion that the Nintendo 64 is the greatest console of all time. I mean, honestly.
Obviously.
No.
Obviously.
No. The Super Nintendo is...
Four buttons to control the camera, and also whatever else.
Yep. And, honestly, the Super Nintendo, I don't think could be beat. I mean, I did the very best I could to present my case for PlayStation 2. And it was difficult, you guys. I'm going to be honest with you, because...
You blew it by not knowing about the bullet time.
But, I tried so hard to do my research on the PlayStation 2 while in my heart knowing that there's just no question about it. The Super Nintendo is the GOAT, honestly. And one thing Dan taught me today was that most controllers are based off of that Super Nintendo controller. I did not know that. So we learn something new every day, I guess. But anyway...
It's just the perfect design.
It really was. It really was. So I wanted to thank you guys for joining us for the first episode of the Console Kingdom. Coming up next, we're going to go dive into our Final Fantasy retrospective. Great times to be had there. The next episode will be focusing mainly on Final Fantasy through Final Fantasy VI, our thoughts and memories of those games. And then coming after that will be the PlayStation era. And as always, I want to thank you guys for joining us. I am your host, Jared.
I am your co-host, Dan. Thank you, lords, ladies, and loyal subjects of the Console Kingdom.
Fellow travelers and adventurers. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time here in the Console Kingdom. Game on.